The private dining suite on the 41st floor was the kind of room designed so that power could breathe without ever being challenged. Soft amber sconces, marble the color of old money, silence trimmed with the hum of a city unaware of the $320 million contract about to be signed on a linen-covered table. She moved quietly between the chairs, carrying a silver carafe as if it were a shield. To the men gathered, she was the girl who pours the tea, nothing more. But the billionaire at the head of the table, Sheikh Rafik al-Dareh, had arrived with a pen already uncapped. That was his way of asserting inevitability. He looked at her only when she misheard his gesture toward the documents, or rather, when he believed she misheard. He made a small remark in a clipped Gulf dialect, a joke meant for the room, dismissive and comfortable, crafted to bounce off someone who supposedly wouldn't understand. "You don't even understand what I said," he chuckled, shaking his head. The room laughed with him. She didn't. Her pulse hammered once, then steadied. Years of being overlooked had taught her the discipline of silence, but this time something in her spine refused to bend. She placed the carafe on the table with a soft click, lifted her eyes, and answered, calmly, precisely. In classical Arabic. The air fractured. The men froze. The joke died on the marble, and for the first time since she entered the room, he truly looked at her. There was always a moment, she knew, when invisibility could be broken. But she never expected it to happen here, under this lighting, before a contract worth more than anything she would earn in 10 lifetimes. He stared at her walking away, unable to understand how he had missed someone like her. For a long moment, no one breathed. The phrase she had spoken, clear, formal, impersuadably precise, hung in the air like something forbidden. Classical Arabic did that to people. It exposed their dialects, their shortcuts, their upbringing. It leveled hierarchies in a way money could not. Rafik's smile tightened first, then collapsed entirely. His eyes sharpened, recalibrating the way men do when an assumption dies. The board members beside him shifted in their seats, performing micro-adjustments of posture that attempted to rewrite the last 30 seconds of their lives. She felt all of it while retreating to the corner of the room. The discomfort, the offended pride, the silent calculation of men who were suddenly aware that the waitress they mocked had just spoken in the language of scholars. Still, she kept her gaze down. She knew better than to appear defiant. A supervisor stepped into the suite, a tall man with a waistcoat too tight for his ambition. He had heard her answer. She could tell from the panic behind his professional smile. "Is everything all right here?" he asked, voice thin. Rafik waved him off, but the gesture carried irritation now. "Just an unexpected talent," he said, the clipped dialect drying out on his tongue. He glanced at her again, this time not with curiosity, but with suspicion, as if fluency were a weapon she might draw. "Where did you study?" he asked. She bowed her head slightly. "Nowhere that matters to this room, sir." The truth was crueler, a scholarship revoked, a visa nearly lost, a thesis abandoned. Years of linguistic work dissolved into the necessity of rent payments and dishwashing shifts. Yet her voice betrayed none of that. Rafik looked back at the contract folder on the table, a thick, leather-bound portfolio whose weight seemed lighter than the tension she had just introduced into the negotiation. "Well," he muttered, "you can go." But the lead consultant, a man with perfect grooming and an unshakable belief in his own expertise, raised a hand. "Actually," he said, "since she understands the language, she may as well stay and purr." Her supervisor nodded too quickly. That was the humiliation. Not the joke, not the condescension, but the decision made about her without including her at all. She was no longer invisible. She was inconvenient, and inconvenience needed to be contained. So she stayed. She walked back toward the table, each step a study in neutrality. The contract lay open between the men now, pages filled with ornate calligraphy and historical seals, supposedly authentic to a 15th century manuscript acquisition. The air smelled faintly of paper, ink, and the arrogance of experts. Rafiq's pen hovered above the signature line, a gesture he repeated when he wanted to remind a room that he controlled the clock. She watched him, watched the pages, watched the men who believed they understood everything. Under the crystal light, humiliation lingered in the spaces between words, proof that power often reveals itself through the way someone corrects a misjudgment. Silent wounds leave the deepest echoes. She stood at the edge of the suite, hands folded behind her apron, the projection of a woman who had accepted her smallness. But inside, her mind drifted to the nights that had shaped her, the ones that made invisibility feel safer than ambition. There had been a time when she believed language could save her, that a girl raised between two countries, two cultures, and two versions of herself might carve a place in the world through philology. She remembered the library where she spent her scholarship years. Cold lighting, dust rising from vellum sheets, the thrill of decoding medieval marginalia. Those hours were the closest she had ever felt to certainty. Then her father fell ill. The scholarship board withdrew funding. The rent tripled. Her studies collapsed like poorly bound parchment. She worked in silence, cafes, cleaning shifts, translation gigs that paid barely enough to buy groceries. And when the last immigration paperwork required proof of stable employment, the luxury tower's hospitality program became her lifeline, a place where her degree didn't matter, where her accent didn't provoke questions, where she could fold her brilliance into the job until it became invisible. Being unseen had advantages. It meant no one asked why a woman who once analyzed manuscripts was now carrying trays. It meant no investor, no board member, no sheikh ever suspected she could read contracts better than their legal teams. Still, tonight felt different. Something about the contract's presence, its ornate seals, its suspiciously pristine pages, had stirred an old instinct in her. The instinct that used to wake her at night during her thesis, spot the inconsistency before it devours the truth. She told herself not to look, not to think, not to fall into the old, dangerous hunger for meaning. But the room made it hard. The men argued over valuation figures and provenance claims. The lead consultant praised the manuscript acquisition as a once-in-a-generation find, while another expert described the calligraphy as beautifully preserved. Their voices grew louder, and she recognized the tone, certainty built over sand. And Rafiq. He kept glancing at her. Not with curiosity now, but with the desperate pride of a man who could not allow a waitress to disrupt the architecture of his authority. She felt heat crawl up her neck. It reminded her of the day she lost her scholarship. The administrator speaking to her slowly, as if her collapse were a translation error. The humiliation then had tasted like metal. Tonight it tasted like déjà vu. Still, she stayed quiet. She poured water. She cleared empty glasses. She pretended not to notice the pages of the contract, even as her eyes kept drifting back to one particular seal. Too crisp, too perfect, wrong in a way she could not yet articulate. The trap was there. She felt it before she understood it. Invisible people often see what everyone else overlooks. She had hoped to slip out quietly after refilling the last glass, but the supervisor intercepted her with a smile carved from panic. "Stay inside," he whispered. "They want full service during the presentation. Don't leave unless asked." The door closed behind him, sealing her in with the weight of the room. The presentation screen descended from the ceiling with a soft, mechanical sigh. Its glow spread across the suite like the opening of an autopsy theater. The men leaned back, relaxing into their roles. Rafiq exhaled sharply, regaining his confidence as the lead consultant approached the center. "Gentlemen," the consultant said, "what you see here is not just a manuscript. It is the single most valuable historical acquisition of this decade." She moved to the back corner again, where shadows softened her presence. But even from there, she felt the consultant's voice cut through the air with calculated authority. A slideshow of images appeared. Parchment pages, gold leaf borders, ink strokes too perfect for their claimed century. The consultant discussed provenance chains, auction records, expert validations. He spoke about impeccable continuity, unbroken custody, unaltered vellum. The words sounded rehearsed, polished like a sales pitch aimed not at scholars but at billionaires who believed certainty could be bought. Rafiq nodded along, pleased now, leaning into the performance. Every slide showed numbers climbing, estimated valuation, insurance caps, cultural significance claims. His pen tapped the table in a steady rhythm, a man preparing himself to sign a story he wanted to believe. She tried to focus only on her role, refill, clear, step back. But the images pulled at her. The vellum looked too uniform, the script too consistent, the seals too theatrical. The consultant moved into technical terrain. "Notice the aging patterns," he said proudly. "Authentic micro-cracking along the pigment, natural oxidation, period-correct tooling." She felt her breath thin. Oxidation like that did not occur naturally across all illuminated sections at the same rate. Not in genuine 15th century manuscripts, but she stayed silent. She didn't dare react visibly. Then came the moment she hated most. The consultant gestured toward her without looking. "Our staff will remain throughout," he said. "It's important the service doesn't break our flow." He meant she wasn't allowed to leave. Rafiq's eyes followed the gesture. "Yes," he added. "Let her stay. She can listen, maybe learn something tonight." Some of the men chuckled. The burn beneath her sternum returned, humiliation disguised as permission. She stayed still. She stayed small. But her mind sharpened, a blade waking from years of disuse. And as the consultant flipped to the next slide, a magnified seal print that looked almost identical to a museum piece she had once studied, she felt a slow, cold recognition spread through her. She was trapped in the room. But so was the truth. And in rooms like this, discomfort reveals more than confidence ever will. The consultant dimmed the lights further, plunging the suite into a half-shadow that made every face look sculpted by ambition. The projection cast shifting gold across the table, illuminating the contract like a relic on an altar. Rafiq leaned forward, hands clasped, eyes gleaming with the satisfaction of a man finally claiming what others had failed to obtain. "Perfection," the consultant declared. "Nothing like this has surfaced in private markets for at least a century." The men murmured approval. Perfection, the word that always preceded mistakes. She stood near the drink station, pretending to polish a glass, but her gaze drifted again to the enlarged manuscript images. The crispness of the script, the immaculate borders, the suspiciously intact gilding. Everything was too aligned, too symmetrical, too eager to present itself as authentic. A manuscript this old should have been a survivor. Beautiful, yes, but wounded. This one had no wounds. Her stomach tightened. The consultant clicked to the next slide. A diagram appeared, illustrating fiber analysis performed on the vellum. "You'll notice minimal contamination," he said, pride swelling in his voice. "Rare for its age, but not unheard of among well-preserved royal collections." She blinked. Minimal contamination? On 15th century vellum? Impossible without aggressive conservation, which would have left chemical traces. Then came the second expert, a man whose suit cost more than her annual income. He stepped forward with the theatrical confidence of someone accustomed to being right. "The calligraphy," he said, is pristine. It shows no signs of revision, no corrections, a perfect primary hand. Her fingers stiffened around the glass. Perfect calligraphy across an entire manuscript of that scale? No marginalia, no scrape marks, no adjustments under raking light. That wasn't perfect. That was manufactured. But the room loved the performance. Even Rafiq, who relied on instinct more than expertise, nodded approvingly. The praise fed his pride, confirming the narrative he wanted, that he, among all collectors, had secured the crown jewel. She felt increasingly trapped between two versions of reality, the one sold on the screen and the one whispering in her memory from long nights in the university lab, where genuine manuscripts breathed with imperfection. "Service," one of the board members said sharply. She hurried forward, refilling glasses, shifting plates, letting the conversation drift above her like smoke. But she caught fragments. Unmatched authenticity. Flawless execution. Once-in-a-lifetime acquisition. Each word struck her like a quiet warning. The louder the certainty, the more dangerous the lie. As she stepped back into the shadows, her eyes landed on the table's reflection in the polished marble floor. The contract lay open, awaiting a signature worth $320 million, and the men around it were already celebrating. Everyone saw perfection. Only she felt the wrongness, and sometimes the first sign of danger is the feeling you're not meant to have. The presentation shifted from spectacle to persuasion, and she felt the room's temperature rise with it. Confidence filled the air like a slow fog. The consultants were no longer describing, they were selling, and every man at the table leaned in the way gamblers do when they think the game is already theirs. She kept to the perimeter, but her mind refused to remain quiet. The instincts she had buried, comparison, deduction, linguistic pattern recognition, began peeling back the layers of the manuscript claims faster than she could suppress them. She watched the experts gesture at diagrams of ink aging curves, but she recognized the dataset format. Modern software modeling, not historical chromatography. The slides mimicked authenticity rather than proved it. One of the board members, a man with silver hair and the arrogance of inherited wealth, asked, "And the seals? You're confident about their provenance?" The lead consultant smiled like someone unveiling a miracle. "Absolutely. The seals show period-accurate compression, and the imprint depth matches what we'd expect from royal ateliers." Her breath stopped. Compression depth. Royal ateliers. Those phrases weren't wrong, but they were incomplete. And incomplete truth was the most dangerous kind, because it fooled even the speaker. She stepped toward the beverage station to keep her hands busy. The consultant flipped to a slide that compared the manuscript's main seal to an authenticated museum sample. The outlines were indeed similar, nearly identical. Too identical. Real seals varied, they degraded, they slipped, they bore the tremors of human hands. These two looked machine-aligned, printed from the same master. Her heartbeat turned heavy. She looked toward the table again, and for a second she felt the ache of her past life so sharply she had to grip the edge of the counter. She remembered sitting in the university's manuscript lab, gloves on, lights dim, adjusting the microscope until each ink fissure revealed its history. She remembered whispering notes into a recorder because she didn't trust her hands not to shake. She had once been good at this. She had once mattered. And now, here she was, the only person in the room who saw the cracks forming under the narrative, yet the one with the least right to speak. "Bring the tea!" the supervisor hissed from the doorway, misreading her stillness as incompetence. She carried the ornate tray to the head of the table. Rafiq ignored her completely now, immersed in the crescendo of validation unfolding before him. His pen rested beside the contract, like a blade waiting to be unsheathed. "Gentlemen," the consultant concluded, Tonight marks the acquisition of a national treasure. Truly flawless. Flawless. She set the tray down gently, but her pulse hammered in her ears. Flawless was the word liars used when they hoped no one would check twice. Reality, she knew, always left fingerprints. And the absence of them was its own evidence. The consultants moved into their final segment, the part meant to seal the psychological deal before the financial one. The lights dimmed further, leaving the room lit only by the projection and the amber sconces along the walls. The men looked softened by wealth, sharpened by desire. The contract lay between them like a living thing. She lingered near the corner, trying to make her breath sound normal. But everything in her felt wrong. The gilding on the manuscript, the uniformity of the calligraphy, the identical seal impressions. Every detail flickered like a warning light only she could see. Rafik leaned back in his chair, the posture of a man who believed the world had bent in his favor. His confidence radiated across the table. "Let's conclude," he said. "I have waited long enough." The consultants exchanged quick, satisfied smiles. The final slide appeared, a valuation graph climbing in a steep, vertical line, the kind meant to overwhelm reason with the promise of profit. "This acquisition," the lead consultant said, "positions your foundation as the sole custodian of a manuscript scholars believed lost. Its market appreciation alone is projected to exceed $500 million within 3 years." Gasps, murmurs, the intoxicating scent of imminent triumph. Her hands trembled. She hid them behind her apron. Because there it was, the shift, the pivot from historical significance to financial seduction. That was always the moment when truth became expendable. She watched the consultant pick up a laser pointer and trace the curve of the graph. "Authenticity," he said, "is not merely confirmed. It is absolute." Absolute. She bit the inside of her cheek so hard she tasted metal. Rafik nodded once, pleased, and reached for the folder containing the final contract. The leather creaked softly as he opened it. His pen clicked, a small, sharp sound that cut through the dark. The tension in the room pulled tight like a bowstring. Her gaze couldn't leave the contract. Even from a distance, she saw the gilded header, the ornate borders, the legal language wrapped in ceremonial flourishes. Decorative enough to distract from the real clauses buried deep inside. Her mind traced possibilities. Indemnity traps, burden-shifting clauses, conditional ownership transfers disguised as heritage protections. She had seen these tactics before, not in luxury suites, but in student loan agreements, in predatory rental contracts, in the fine print of survival. She exhaled slowly, forcing the air through her lungs. The truth inside her pressed against her ribs, demanding to be spoken. But who would listen? A waitress with a lost scholarship? A migrant woman with no institutional affiliation? Someone whose brilliance existed only in the privacy of old notebooks? Rafik placed the nib of his pen on the signature line. She felt the air thicken, heavy and electric, like the second before glass shatters. Sometimes disaster announces itself not with noise but with silence so deep it feels like a choice. And silence, she realized, was how people were ruined. The moment the pen touched the paper, the projection dimmed, replaced by a resting screen of gilded motifs. The consultant stepped back with reverent smiles, giving Rafik the ceremonial space to inscribe his name over a $320 million commitment. And then it happened. Quiet, almost unremarkable. A page of the contract shifted under the breeze of the ceiling vent. Just a half-inch flutter, but enough for her trained eyes to glimpse something she could not unsee. A discrepancy. The seal printed on the acquisition summary page, the one framed as photographic evidence of authenticity, did not match the seal on the legal page beneath it. At first glance, the two were identical, but their micro-shadows betrayed them. The curvature of the lower left quadrant differed by a fraction too precise to be natural. Genuine hand-stamped seals never aligned exactly, and when photographed under museum lighting, their depth signatures never repeated. This one repeated. Her heart thudded. Her gaze snapped to the slideshow remote left carelessly on the consultant's podium. The last slide still lingered in her mind. The authenticated museum seal they had used for comparison. She remembered its asymmetry, a tiny compression dent on the upper right corner. The contract seal had the same dent. Not similar, the same. An exact digital replication printed onto vellum-like paper, likely with laser texturing. A counterfeit created using a reference not meant to be shared. Her pulse surged, the trap crystallized. If Rafiq signed, he would be accepting a forged manuscript into his foundation. His foundation would legally inherit liability for claiming authenticity. And hidden inside such contracts, she knew this from small, cruel experiences, was always a clause transferring responsibility away from the seller and onto the buyer upon execution, meaning he would lose even if he won. Rafiq, oblivious, inhaled, as though preparing to bless the document with his signature. She stepped forward before she realized she'd moved. The tray she held rattled from the tremor in her hand, just enough to make the silverware clink. Heads turned. The air shifted. Rafiq's irritation sparked instantly. "What now?" he snapped, the clipped Gulf dialect returning like a blade. She froze, but her eyes, unbidden, fell again to the contract. There. Another anomaly. Vellum edges too clean. Ink too uniform. A faint chemical sheen catching the amber light. The kind left by synthetic aging compounds. She forced her breath steady. The consultants watched her as one watches a fly near a chandelier, dismissively but with annoyance. "Is there a problem?" one asked, tone brittle. She didn't answer. Not yet. The truth was swelling inside her like a rising tide, pressing against the last walls of fear, holding it back. And in that moment, she understood that every small, humiliating moment of her life had prepared her for this single point in time. A room full of powerful men, a fraudulent treasure, and the unbearable weight of being the only one who saw what was real. Sometimes the first crack in a lie is as small as noticing a shadow where none should exist. Rafiq lowered his pen again, determined to complete what he viewed as a historic moment. The consultants leaned in with restrained anticipation, rehearsed smiles prepared for the celebratory handshake. Even the silence felt scripted, the kind that precedes a public announcement, a press release, a legacy-defining acquisition. And then she spoke. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough for the room to hear. "Sir, please don't sign." The words fell like a shard of glass hitting marble. Every head turned, every pair of eyes narrowed. Rafiq froze mid-stroke, as though his hand had been caught in an act he didn't want witnessed. Slowly, he lifted his gaze toward her with incredulity, darkening into insult. "What did you say?" he asked, voice tightening. Her throat tried to close. Years of being small told her to apologize immediately. Bow, retreat, blame nerves. But her eyes dropped once more to the mismatched seals, their impossible symmetry glaring back at her like a truth she could no longer ignore. She straightened her spine. "You should review the authenticity documents before you sign," she said softly. "There are inconsistencies." The consultants erupted first. "This is inappropriate." "She is not qualified." "Remove her from the room, now." Her supervisor rushed forward, mortified. "I'm so sorry, sir. She doesn't understand." But Rafiq raised a hand, silencing everyone. His pride bristled, but something colder flickered beneath it. Curiosity. The same curiosity that drove him to collect things others deemed impossible to obtain. "What inconsistencies?" he demanded. Her palms dampened. She wasn't ready to present anything. She wasn't trained for this room, this scale, these egos. But she had spent years studying manuscripts in a lab lit by flickering bulbs and outdated equipment. And truth, when you know it intimately, becomes impossible to betray. She stepped closer, not to the table, but to the projection still faintly glowing behind the consultants. "The seal on the summary page," she said carefully, "is an exact match to the authenticated museum seal you showed earlier. Not similar, identical. Down to a distortion mark that would never repeat naturally." One of the consultants scoffed. "You're mistaken. The seals simply—" She cut him off with a quiet firmness that surprised even herself. "Genuine seals differ with every stamping. Pressure variations, micro shifts, imperfections. But these two are digital twins." Rafiq's expression shifted, not to belief, but to suspicion. She continued before fear could silence her again. "The vellum edges are machine-cut. The ink fissures are uniform across the entire manuscript, which is chemically impossible. And the oxidation, it's manufactured." "This is absurd," the second expert snapped. "You are a waitress." Her voice barely wavered. "I studied philology. Before, life changed." She swallowed. But truth doesn't care about job titles. She saw it then, a flicker in Rafiq's eyes, the tiniest hesitation. The first fracture in his confidence. She had interrupted the signing. She had broken the script. Whether they listened or not, the room would never return to its previous shape. Power shifts the moment someone brave enough steps into the silence others avoid. The room reacted like a single organism pierced through its center. The consultants stiffened. The board members exchanged quick, alarmed glances. Rafiq leaned back slowly, pen still in hand, weighing the humiliation of being corrected against the possibility, however small, that she might be right. "Explain," he said. A single word, but it opened the door she needed. She approached the table with careful steps, aware of how the consultants tracked her every move, like guards watching an intruder. She did not touch the contract. That would break the invisible rules of the room. But she stood close enough to see the seals again under the amber sconces. Her breath steadied. "The seal on this page," she began, "is not impressed into the surface. It's printed." She tilted her head toward the projection screen. "Look at the museum comparison image you used. The dent on the right edge. A unique pressure slip. It appears here, exactly the same. Pixel for pixel." The lead consultant forced a laugh. "Coincidence. She's over-analyzing shadows." "No," she said. "Shadows vary with angle. This one doesn't. That's the signature of a digital overlay." Rafiq's brows tightened. She pointed, without touching, to the contract's lower margin. "Real vellum fibers fray unevenly. These are trimmed clean, like archival facsimile stock. And the ink—" She inhaled sharply. "When period ink ages, it dries at multiple rates. It cracks unpredictably. Here, the fissures repeat in identical patterns across several pages. That only happens when someone applies synthetic aging chemical washes." A board member snapped. "This is absurd. You're accusing our experts of fraud." She met his eyes with a steadiness she didn't know she possessed. "I'm saying the manuscript they authenticated is not the one described in the contract." Silence. Even the consultants froze. She pressed on before they could recover. "The oxidation in the gilding. It stops exactly where the illumination meets the parchment, like a mask was applied before artificial darkening. Authentic manuscripts show seepage, microscopic bleeding into surrounding fibers. But here, the gold stays unnaturally bright. Rafik shifted forward, the logic striking him harder than her words. "So you're saying," he murmured, "that the manuscript was fabricated?" She hesitated. Fabricated, or substituted. That landed like thunder. The consultants erupted. "This is slander. She's utterly unqualified. You're letting a server jeopardize a multi-million-dollar deal." But their panic only fueled her clarity. "Check page 9 of the provenance section," she said quietly. "The watermark alignment is off by 0.5 millimeter, not horizontally, rotationally. That only happens when someone prints 2 halves of a forged watermark template and merges them." Rafik's breath left him in a slow exhale. The consultant's faces paled. She stepped back, suddenly aware that she had stepped far beyond what the room would forgive. Her pulse throbbed like a bruise forming beneath her skin. But the truth was laid bare now, undeniable, ugly, echoing across the marble. Every forgery leaves a trail. Some trails require courage to follow. For a long, suspended moment, no one spoke. The suite felt colder now, as though the walls themselves had recoiled from what she had revealed. The contract lay open between them. Once an object of prestige, now a quiet accusation. Rafik broke the silence first. "Show me," he said. His voice no longer carried arrogance. It carried fear. The particular kind that only comes when a man realizes he may have been played not just financially, but publicly. She circled to the side of the table, careful not to cross boundaries she knew existed around wealth and power. The consultants hovered behind Rafik, their faces stiff with a dawning panic they tried to hide behind indignation. She pointed to a section buried halfway down the second legal page, a block of dense text wrapped in ceremonial flourishes, decorative script, gold filigree, beautiful by design, distracting by intention. "This clause," she said softly, "is the real danger, not the forged manuscript." Rafik frowned. "Read it." "Huh?" The consultants moved to interrupt, but he silenced them with a single raised finger. She leaned in just enough to see the words. It says the acquisition is transferred under a custodial authenticity framework. It sounds harmless, but the framework reverses the burden of proof. Rafik's eyes sharpened. "Meaning?" "Meaning," she continued, "once you sign, you become responsible for proving the manuscript is real, even if it's not." A stunned silence rippled across the room. "And if I discover the fraud?" he asked. She swallowed. "The clause prohibits litigation against the seller for any inconsistency discovered after transfer. It states that variances in material composition are considered part of the manuscript's historic journey." "In English," one board member snapped. "What does that mean?" "It means," she said calmly, "that even if you prove it's fake, you still own it, and you still pay for it, every cent." Rafik's jaw tightened. The consultants stiffened, their polished composure cracking like cheap varnish. She continued, voice steady. "There's more. Look at the indemnity section. It requires your foundation to compensate the seller for any reputational damage resulting from disputes, even private ones." The consultants erupted. "This is misinterpretation. She lacks the training to understand high-level acquisitions. This is outrageous." But Rafik no longer looked at them. He looked only at her. "What else?" he asked quietly. She forced herself not to flinch under the weight of his attention. "The contract also includes a silent transfer clause. If the manuscript is later deemed inauthentic by a third party, even accidentally, you lose custodial rights but keep financial liability. It becomes a legal ghost, a burden without ownership." Rafik closed his eyes. "A trap." "A very expensive one," she replied. The consultants' fear finally surfaced in their voices. "Sir, she's wrong. This is being blown out of... She's misreading." But he didn't let them finish. For the first time that night, the power in the room shifted completely. Not toward the billionaire nor the experts, but toward the quiet woman no one had expected to matter. The truth, once spoken plainly, rearranges every hierarchy it touches. The room ruptured, not in noise, not at first, but in the silent, convulsive tightening of every man's posture. Rafiq leaned back in his chair as though distancing himself physically might help him see the situation more clearly. His eyes no longer held curiosity or irritation. They carried calculation. The consultants sensed it instantly. "Sir," the lead consultant began, his voice pitched unnaturally high, "you're being misled by someone who..." Rafiq lifted a hand, a quiet gesture, a devastating one. "Explain why these clauses exist," he said. The consultant blinked rapidly. "They're standard protective language for high-value transfers." She stepped back, letting the room turn its suspicion inward. The consultant's confidence wilted under scrutiny. She watched their faces carefully. The micro-reactions she had learned to read from behind bar counters and service stations. The twitch at the edge of a jaw, the swallow too quick. The widening of eyes when someone calculates escape routes. They were unraveling. Rafiq leaned forward, his voice low. "Why does the burden of proof shift entirely to me?" The second consultant stepped in, attempting a practiced laugh that died halfway. "It's merely a formal precaution." "Why?" Rafiq interrupted. "Does the indemnity section protect you instead of me?" The first consultant's jaw tightened. "Sir, these are interpreted differently in international arbitration." "And the forged seal?" Rafiq asked sharply. Silence. The consultants exchanged a look. A small, fatal mistake, because it confirmed what they were trying to deny. Rafiq's expression darkened. "You told me the museum authenticated it." "They did. They confirmed. They provided." Their voices tripped over each other. She stepped forward just slightly, the smallest movement, but enough for Rafiq to register her presence again. "Sir," she said quietly, "may I clarify something?" The consultant stiffened in protest. "No," one snapped, "you may not..." But Rafiq's gaze never left her. "Speak." She pointed to the contract's header page. These seals weren't created by the museum. They were lifted from museum archives, digitally. Anyone with restricted access and enough ambition could replicate them. Rafiq turned slowly toward the consultants. "Who prepared these documents?" "We outsourced portions of the research," the lead consultant said. "It's common..." "To whom?" Rafiq asked. No answer. The board members murmured now, their voices thick with suspicion. Money was no longer the focus. Reputation was, and reputations in circles like this were currencies with sharper edges than gold. The consultants tried to recover. "Sir, the acquisition is legitimate. She is misinterpreting technical details." Rafiq slammed his pen onto the table. The sound cracked through the suite like a gunshot. "She identified more anomalies in 10 minutes than you have in 6 months of due diligence," he said. "If she is wrong, prove it. Now." The consultants glanced at each other. Two men drowning in a room that had suddenly become too small. But she saw something they did not. They weren't just caught. They were afraid of who might have been helping them. Exposure was no longer a possibility. It was inevitable. When truth finally corners deceit, it doesn't raise its voice. It simply waits for the guilty to run out of lies. The consultants stood rigid, their polished composure melting under the amber lights. The performance they'd crafted so meticulously, the confidence, the theater of expertise, the vocabulary designed to intimidate, disintegrated into something raw and panicked. Rafiq's board members closed in like a jury. Why weren't these clauses disclosed? Who approved the seal verification? Where is the independent assessment you promised? Each question tightened the noose. The consultants tried to speak over one another, but their contradictions multiplied. One blamed clerical oversight. The other insisted the clauses were industry-standard nuances. Their polished accents, tailored suits, and rehearsed gravitas no longer disguised the cracks splitting open in real time. She had retreated again to the perimeter of the room, watching the collapse she had triggered. She felt neither triumph nor vindication, only the tremor of adrenaline sliding through her veins. The truth had been spoken. Now the room was devouring it, tearing at the seams of the deception. Rafiq rose from his chair slowly, the weight of humiliation pressing onto his shoulders. "I trusted your validation," he said to the consultants. "I trusted your expertise." The lead consultant's voice wavered. "Sir, we were misled as well." A lie. A poorly chosen one. Rafiq advanced a step. "By whom?" The man froze. That silence told the room everything. One of the board members, the silver-haired heir with a taste for conflict, leaned closer to the consultants. "There is only one reason to bury indemnity clauses that protect the seller," he said, "because you are the seller, or you are working for them." The consultants' faces drained of color. Rafiq turned sharply. "Is that true?" "No! Absolutely not! We were retained as independent experts." But the panic in their eyes betrayed them. And though she had seen panic many times, in customers drunk on power, in supervisors desperate to avoid complaints, this panic was different. This was the panic of men who realized the ground beneath them was no longer solid. She saw an opening, not to speak again, but to observe more closely. As the men argued, she watched the lead consultant's fingers. They moved unconsciously to the inside pocket of his jacket, where the presentation remote had been earlier. He wasn't reaching for it. He was protecting it, protecting something incriminating. She inhaled sharply. A realization clicked into place. The slides, the seals, the museum comparison. All curated. All sourced from a digital archive that should have been impossible to access without institutional credentials. He had access, not by accident, not by authorization, by design. One of the board members suddenly hissed. This wasn't a misrepresentation. This was a coordinated substitution. And the entire room went still. Rafiq lowered his voice, cold and precise. "If you were part of a substitution scheme, you were about to make me the legal custodian of a forgery worth nothing but scandal." Neither consultant spoke, because there was no longer anything left to defend. Betrayal needs darkness to survive. Once exposed to light, it withers faster than lies can be replaced. The air thickened into a silence so tight it felt like the suite itself was bracing for impact. The consultant stood pale and motionless, as though any movement might confirm their guilt. Rafiq remained standing at the head of the table, shoulders drawn back, his authority no longer performative but sharpened by betrayal. She watched all of it from her corner, close enough to see micro-reactions, far enough to remain the one person no one could accuse of having anything to gain. Rafiq spoke first, his voice low and dangerous. "Open your briefcase." The lead consultant hesitated. It was a small hesitation, less than a second, but long enough for the room to understand the truth. Rafiq stepped forward. "Now!" With trembling fingers, the consultant unlocked the case. The lid opened with a soft metallic sigh, revealing what she had already expected. A small set of high-resolution museum scans, watermark templates, vellum sheets, synthetic aging compounds, and a laser texturing stylus. A portable forgery kit. Gasps rippled across the table. The silver-haired board member leaned in, eyes widening. You came into this room prepared to correct the evidence if necessary. The consultant's voice cracked. It's not what it looks like. It's exactly what it looks like, she said softly. All heads turned toward her. She swallowed hard, but stepped closer, unable to unsee what she had spent years training herself to recognize. She pointed to the stylus. That model is used to recreate fiber impressions. It's banned in several conservation labs because it mimics aging too convincingly. Her gaze moved to the printed museum seals. These were never meant to leave the archive. Someone either stole them or paid someone who had access. The second consultant snapped. You have no right to... Rafiq's glare shut him down instantly. She continued, her voice steadier now that the truth had shape. The synthetic aging compounds, they only activate under UV. That's why you dimmed the lights during the presentation. Under brighter light, the sheen would have betrayed the forgery. The consultant's silence confirmed everything. One of the board members exhaled sharply. This wasn't an authentication. It was theater. No, Rafiq corrected, his eyes locked on the men who had guided him toward a disaster. This was an ambush. The second consultant's facade finally broke. He stepped forward, hands out as though pleading. We were under pressure. The manuscript was supposed to arrive weeks ago. So you created one, Rafiq roared. The consultant flinched. We substituted it temporarily. The real one was delayed. We were promised it would. Enough. Rafiq's voice cut like a blade. The briefcase remained open on the table, the tools of the scheme illuminated beneath the chandelier's glow. Evidence, no longer deniable. She felt a strange ache in her chest. Not triumph, not satisfaction, but the familiar heaviness of seeing how easily truth could be twisted when profit and pride aligned. Fraud collapses fastest when the people who built it forget to fear the light. The suite no longer felt like a negotiation chamber. It felt like a courtroom without a judge, just the raw, exposed anatomy of deceit under bright, merciless light. The open briefcase sat at the center of the table like a wound, its contents incriminating in their quiet precision. Rafiq turned slowly toward the consultants, his expression carved from disbelief and fury. You were going to let me sign a $320 million contract, he said, and become the public face of a national fraud. The lead consultant's mouth opened, but no words came. His colleague tried first, voice trembling. We were promised the real manuscript would arrive. We were assured. By whom? A board member demanded. The man swallowed, hard. A private intermediary. Rafiq's tone chilled. Name them. Another silence. Another mistake. The silver-haired board member pushed back his chair and stood. Gentlemen, you've exposed this foundation to catastrophic liability. Had the signing proceeded, we would have been responsible for laundering a forgery into the historical record. She watched the consultants shrink beneath the weight of their own unraveling narrative. They weren't masterminds. She could see that clearly now. They were middlemen, intoxicated by access, pressured by unseen benefactors, seduced by the idea of controlling a manuscript worth more than the portfolio of entire museums. But the consequences didn't care about their intentions. Rafiq gestured to his security aide, who had been waiting silently by the door. A discreet signal, nothing harsh, nothing theatrical, but final. The aide approached the consultants. Wait. The lead consultant sputtered. Sir, let us explain. You had your chance, Rafiq said. Security retrieved their phones, their access badges, even the presentation remote. The very tool they had used to orchestrate the illusion of authenticity. The consultants' faces crumpled with the realization that the empire they hoped to manipulate had closed its gates on them. "Escort them downstairs," Rafik instructed. "Keep them in the holding suite until council arrives." The men protested weakly, but fear drained their resistance. They were led out, shoulders slumped, arguments dissolving into incoherent fragments. When the door closed behind them, the suite exhaled collectively. Even the chandelier seemed to steady. Rafik stood unmoving, one hand bracing the back of his chair as if anchoring himself. The board murmured, already discussing damage assessment, legal pathways, containment strategies. But he wasn't listening. His gaze drifted toward her. The quiet woman who had nearly gone unnoticed, who had stepped into the center of a $320 million deception, armed with nothing but memory, instinct, and courage. "You saved me from humiliation," he said finally. "From ruin." "Yeah?" She lowered her eyes, unsure how to receive gratitude from a man who, hours earlier, had mocked her very existence. "It was just the truth," she murmured. He shook his head. "No. Most people see the truth. Very few dare to speak it. In rooms built on power, the smallest voice can become the only one that matters." The suite felt cavernous now that the performance had ended. Without the consultants' voices filling the air with rehearsed authority, the space returned to its original state. A room built for wealth, softened by luxury, hardened by expectation. She stood near the drink station once more, but she no longer blended into the shadows. Every board member's gaze slid toward her at intervals, as if checking whether she was real or a collective hallucination conjured by the crisis. Rafik remained at the head of the table, fingers pressed against his temples. A man who had nearly made a catastrophic decision, not because he lacked intelligence, but because he trusted the wrong people and underestimated the quietest person in the room. The silver-haired board member paced. "We need to notify legal counsel immediately. This contract cannot sit in our system for even an hour." Another whispered, "And the press. If this leaks—" "It won't leak," Rafik said sharply. The room stilled. He took a long breath, regaining the composure he had nearly lost. His gaze swept across the signatures he had almost committed to paper, then drifted back to her once more. "You," he said. She felt the attention prick her skin. Old instincts told her to step back, shrink, disappear, apologize for existing. But she forced herself to remain still. "You understood this manuscript better than the men I paid 7 figures, he continued, "and you recognized anomalies faster than our entire legal department." "I only saw what didn't fit," she said quietly. "That," he replied, "is precisely what expertise is." Her breath hitched. For so long she had carried her training like a secret she could not afford to acknowledge. Now it hung between them, visible under the chandelier's light. One of the board members asked, "What do we do about the intermediary who supplied the consultants?" "Investigate discreetly," Rafik said. "No public accusations until we understand how deep this goes." A murmur of agreement, but he was no longer speaking to them. Not really. He stepped closer to her, not invading, but acknowledging. "What is your name?" She hesitated. "Lena." "Lena," he repeated, as if committing it to memory. "Tonight you prevented a scandal that would have followed me for the rest of my life." Her supervisor reappeared at the door, unsure whether she was in trouble or about to be praised. "Sir, should I—" "You may leave her," Rafik said without looking at him. The man swallowed and retreated. Silence settled again. But this time, it wasn't oppressive. It was contemplative, charged with a different tension, possibility, or danger, or both. Lena's hands trembled slightly, hidden behind the folds of her apron. Her life had been defined by avoidance. Avoiding attention, avoiding mistakes, avoiding anything that might fracture the fragile stability she'd built. But tonight she had stepped forward instead of backward, and something inside her shifted. In every person's story, there comes a moment when survival quietly becomes courage. The board dispersed slowly, leaving papers strewn like discarded illusions across the marble table. Rafik stayed behind, quiet, contemplative, a man recalibrating the architecture of his own judgment. Lena remained near the wall, hands clasped, unsure whether stepping forward again would be boldness or arrogance. When the last board member exited, Rafik finally turned to her. "You saw something none of us did," he said. "Something our experts refused to see." She shook her head. "Anyone trained in manuscript studies would have noticed." "No," he replied. "Most would have doubted themselves before they doubted us." The truth landed heavily. She had doubted herself for years, but tonight she hadn't had the luxury of silence. He walked toward the contract folder, touching its corner with the tips of his fingers, almost as if confirming it was still powerless. "My foundation oversees several cultural acquisitions each year," he said. "We rely on forensic specialists to prevent exactly what almost happened tonight." She frowned, unsure where this was going. He continued softly. "We need someone with your eye." Her stomach tightened. "Sir, I'm not a waitress," he finished gently. "You were never that." Her breath caught. "You recognized forged seals, synthetic aging, mismatched vellum fibers, and contractual traps." His gaze sharpened. "Do you know how rare it is to find someone who can see both the historical deception and the legal one?" She didn't answer. She couldn't. "I'm offering you a position," Rafik said, "not as staff, not as a consultant, as a full member of our forensic acquisitions team." A pulse of disbelief spread through her chest, almost painful. Her mind flooded instantly with all the reasons she should refuse. Her unfinished thesis, her immigration paperwork, her fear of being seen and misseen, her certainty that someone like her didn't belong in a room like this. "I don't have credentials anymore," she whispered. "I left my program. I never finished anything." "You finished something tonight," he said. "You protected a multi-million-dollar foundation from a disaster." He paused, letting the words settle. "And the world doesn't care about the title you lacked, only the truth you delivered." The chandelier's reflection shimmered across the table, fracturing into little gold fragments. For a moment, she saw herself in them, shaken, exhausted, but standing in a place she never meant to reach. She looked down at her hands, still faintly trembling. "I don't know if I can do this." "You already did," he replied. "All you need now is a place where your skill is visible." The room felt different now. No longer suffocating, but strangely open, as if a door she didn't know existed had quietly unlocked. Lena exhaled. Slowly. For the first time in years, it didn't feel like surrender. It felt like arrival. Every life has a threshold moment, when the world stops shrinking and begins to expand again. A year later, Lena walked through the quiet halls of the Forensic Acquisitions Institute, not as staff, not as a shadow, but as a specialist whose presence carried weight. The glass walls reflected her in soft fragments, a woman steadier, surer, no longer afraid to take up space. She spent her days examining manuscripts, artifacts, contracts, tracing truth through ink and fiber, guiding foundations away from traps woven in fine print and false history. Her work was quiet, meticulous, invisible to the public, but deeply, profoundly hers. Her apartment was no longer a room she hid inside. She paid rent without fear. She cooked without counting groceries. She slept without rehearsing what could go wrong. Sometimes, late at night, she opened the notebook where her abandoned thesis lived. She no longer saw a failure. She saw a path she had taken the long way around and survived. And in rare moments, when she passed a reflective surface, she caught her own eyes and almost didn't recognize them. Calm, present, unhidden. Lena had once believed her life would remain small, folded into corners, unnoticed, unremarkable. But the night she spoke up in a room where she was never meant to matter, everything shifted. Truth changes the world only when someone dares to give it a voice. If this story moved you, share it, like it, and subscribe for more.